This was probably Khrushchev's most triumphant moment in front of the Americans. Just after the May Day holiday in 1960, the United States announced that one of their civilian meteorological research planes disappeared in northern Turkey. Not realizing that, Khrushchev turned his head and threw out a resounding slap in the face, announcing that the plane was in fact an invasion of the Soviet Union spy plane, which had been shot down by the Soviets, with the plane's cameras and tape recorders intact, while also captured the pilot on board. The mysterious black plane that caused the trouble was the U-2 high-altitude strategic reconnaissance plane, the representative of the latest technology at that time. President Eisenhower, who was slapped in the face, was a bit confused for a while. Didn't some people say that at that time no fighter planes or missiles could reach the U-2, and where exactly did it go wrong? He also did not know that in order to shoot down this U-2, in fact, the Soviet Union itself paid a greater price. In order to this reconnaissance aircraft nicknamed Black Widow, all the people put their lives on the line. In the 1950s, this blacked-out fellow was a skyfi presence, and with a range of more than 4,000 kilometers and an altitude of up to 27,000 meters, it was out of the reach of any fighter and surface-to-air missile at the time, and was strong enough to defy all air defenses on the planet. In order to collect Soviet intelligence information, the Americans in the U-2 integrated a variety of top technological equipment at the time. It carries a high-altitude camera equipped with very good lenses and film cartridges with an amazing capacity. The ground on the highly classified facilities to it at a glance, out of a mission, just to take pictures, can be piled up in a room. Since hearing about the ability to go deep into the Soviet Union to engage in snooping, President Eisenhower immediately took an interest in the U-2 and decided to commission British pilots to go on a first trip over the Soviet Union, where they were not part of the CIA or the US military, and in case they were shot down, it would look good to save face and avoid starting a war. The results of the adventure were encouraging, and both heart-stopping spy missions were a resounding success, giving the US. But it also triggered a diplomatic protest from the Soviet Union. Apparently, Soviet radar can see the U-2, but there seems to be nothing that can be done about it at the moment. Faced with the great lure of intelligence, the bigwigs decided to test the waters a little, for they're on the brink of death. And in order to show their hand at the Four Nations Summit in May 1960, Eisenhower decided to go for the big one, with US pilots flying U-2 reconnaissance planes in person on espionage missions in order to gather more detailed intelligence data. On April 9, 1960, Bob Erickson flew a CIA U-2C reconnaissance plane deep into Soviet airspace, overflying 4 top-secret Soviet military targets in a single pass before finally landing at Stahedin Airport in Iran. Surprisingly, there was no reaction from the Soviet side to the incursion, which emboldened the Americans to decide on an additional flight. The spy mission, codenamed Grand Slam, was carried out by Francis Powers and was repeatedly delayed due to weather conditions until the early morning hours of May 1, 1960. 4 days later, when Powers was cleared to board the plane for takeoff. When was preparing to participate in the parade, Khrushchev heard that the US Army U-2 spy plane in this time. The whole person is not good, he stormed. Immediately gave the Territorial Defense Air Force gave the death order, at all costs, no matter what, to shoot down this invasion of the spy plane. By this time, Powers had flown to Tyuratam and maneuvered to get the best camera angle to photograph the ICBM test site there. And next he was flying north to Sverdlovsk. Having received a death warrant from the leadership, this was a busy time for all in the Homeland Defense Air Force, from the marshals to the enlisted men. Major General Solodovnikov, deputy commander of the Defense Air Force, decided to take a multi-pronged approach, ordering all surface-to-air missile facilities on the U-2 route to be put on high alert on the one hand, and taking off fighters to intercept them on the other. Unexpectedly, it was this order that almost caused a big mess. Soon, one of the Su-9 interceptors stationed in Perm took off in an emergency. It was supposed to be a 2-plane formation. But there was no way, the pilots were all on vacation at the moment, and the pilot on it, Menshikov was still temporarily grabbed from a bus stop and didn't even have time to put on a pressurized chute. The Su-9's ceiling is only 17,000 meters. In order to reduce weight and increase the ceiling, this Su-9 does not carry any weapons. The base commander hopes to use this to allow the Su-9 to climb to the same altitude as the U-2, so that it is to crash also to knock down the U-2. Menshikov, who was temporarily arrested, knew that this trip would be a one-way ticket. Meanwhile, in a Sam-air defense missile base near Sverdlovsk, Major Mikhail Voronov, dressed in his military uniform in preparation for the parade, received an order from the missile command that the U-2 spy plane was on its way here and must be shot down immediately. The air defense missile company under his command had just been outfitted with a new surface-to-air missile, the Sadu, and had completed its initial training only a few days ago. This missile was developed specifically for nuclear-armed U.S. strategic bombers, but the first target against which it was not thought to be equipped was the U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. In the U-2 spy plane at this moment, Powers was methodically executing his flight plan, unaware of the turn of events on the ground. At this point, he was on a planned flyby of Chelyabinsk 65 to take photographs of the secret plutonium production facility here. Unbeknownst to him, Menshikov's Su-9 was desperately trying to get here from the rear under the command of ground guidance, and the Su-9, with only its scalp on, reached U-2's altitude as it had been expected to do, and Menshikov activated his radar as he had been ordered to do. But there was so much interference on the screen that he couldn't see anything for a while. The ground control center shouted that the target was just ahead, but to expect that the Su-9, flying at Mach 1.5 with power on, could see the sesame-sized U-2 with a naked eye in the air was overthinking it. Even if he saw it, how to maneuver the supersonic aircraft to accurately hit the subsonic U-2 was also a problem. So Menshikov piloted Su-9. Supersonic speed instantly swept past the U-2. Both pilots did not see each other. Menshikov breathed a sigh of relief. He did not have enough fuel for a second impact, and could only turn off the acceleration to return to base. But he did not realize that bad luck was still ahead. Two MiG-19s then scrambled into the air, and although they simply couldn't fly at that altitude, the base commander felt that something should always be done. At this time in the Sam-air defense missile base, Major Voronov commanded the soldiers had already energized and warmed up the Satu surface-to-air missiles and prepared them for combat. When Powers arrived about 56 kilometers southeast of Sverdlovsk, Major Voronov activated the button to fire the missiles. Regulations called for 2 missiles to be fired at a time, but this was a special case, and the Major had 3 missiles ready at a time. But when the soldier pressed the button, only one of the missiles managed to launch, the other 2 didn't move at all. The Satu's hit rate was only 70%, and a chill rose up Voronov's back, now that the only successfully launched missile was his only hope, and it was 8:53 am, Moscow time. Powers, who was flying at the edge of the atmosphere, suddenly saw a flash of fire in the sky, and then felt a jolt in the fuselage. Voronov's Satu missile blew up next to the U-2, blowing the plane's tail to pieces, and the whole plane immediately fell into a loss of control, falling into a spiral state. And then the high-speed airflow tore the wings and the fuselage apart, and the plane began to fall like a stone from the height of 20,000 meters at a high speed. Powers was blinded by the explosion and forced himself to wake up from the shock, surrounded by alarm bells, the altimeter rotating rapidly. Now there is only one way to escape by parachute. He unbuckled his seatbelt, and just as he opened the cockpit cover, the cockpit depressurized instantly, and the high-speed air currents ripped through the cover while sucking Powers out. With his oxygen tube still removed, Powers was trapped outside the plane and allowed the high-speed downdraft to pull him toward the ground. Powers, who was being blown around by the air currents, finally managed to rip off the oxygen tube after a lot of hard work. He pulled open the parachute, fumbled to find the silver dollar hanging around his neck, which hid a poison needle used for suicide. Better to die than to live. Powers did not even think about it, a hand to throw it. Voronov on the ground only saw the radar signals disappear, and then lit up a lot of signals, and not 100% sure that the U-2 has been shot down. These new signals were in fact U-2 blowing up fragments. Did not think that these fragments can stir up a hornet's nest. The deputy commander of the Soviet Defense Air Force, Major General Solodovnikov, ordered, regardless of whether these signals are U-2 or signal jammers, they are to be taken out. The remaining 3 anti-aircraft missiles around Sverdlovsk can be considered to have seized the opportunity to perform after connecting to the order, and have locked on to their targets and started firing missiles. This was hard on the 3 MiG-19s searching for U-2 in the air and Su-9s that were returning. Being on vacation, the technicians hadn't yet switched the enemy identification code to the new one for May, and this frantic output from the surface-to-air missiles had directly blindsided them. 1 MiG-19 was successfully shot down, and the pilot died after parachuting out. Luckily, the Sa-2 only had a 70% hit rate, or it's hard to tell how many of those 4 planes would still be left. When Bowers parachuted to the ground, farmers from the local state farm immediately surrounded him and subsequently transported him to the Soviet base. All the while, missiles were still being fired into the air from the ground, with a total of 14 missiles going out in the space of half an hour. Khrushchev, after learning that the U-2 had been shot down, was happy to celebrate the defense and air forces, and after visiting the wreckage of the U-2, he decided not to say anything, just to see how the Americans would make up a story later. As expected, the US government, after learning that the U-2 had disappeared over the Soviet Union, assumed that the pilot was dead, and casually made up a blind story about NASA weather planes in an attempt to muddle through, only to be hit hard in the face by the high-altitude camera on the U-2. The Americans could only keep pulling their punches, saying that the plane was lost and strayed into Soviet airspace, only to have the Soviets come up with Powers' admission of guilt. One after another, President Eisenhower's face was swollen, and incidentally, the 4-nation summit was spoiled. Powers was sentenced to 10 years in prison, after serving 2 years through the spy exchange back to the United States. But the U-2 halted in the Soviet Union, did not let the United States dead hard in the Soviet Union after a nose, and began to use the U-2 to China to try their luck. Did not expect the loss of the worst before and after a total of 5 U-2 was shot down. But that's another story. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.